At
I need you to
73,
hurry.
Martha
They're
Bennett
coming.
lost
Please pick up
everything:
the other line.
her husband, her home, and almost her place in the world. Around her, the town was fading, stores closing, people packing up and leaving. But Martha didn't leave. She stayed and used her last savings to buy an abandoned post office. 3 days later, a loose floorboard led her to a hidden room no one had opened in years. What she found inside wasn't just a secret. It was the truth her husband never got to finish. Before we go on, tell me where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. The sky hung low and gray, pressing softly over a town that had long since forgotten how to expect anything new. Martha Bennett was 73 the morning she packed the last of her things into a worn cardboard box. The house felt smaller than it used to, not because the walls had moved, but because everything inside it had already been decided. What stayed, what went, what could no longer be carried forward. She moved carefully, not out of frailty, but habit. Years had taught her that rushing rarely changed the outcome of anything that mattered. Martha was a small woman, just over 5 feet tall, her frame narrow and steady rather than fragile. Her silver hair was always tied back in a loose knot, strands escaping no matter how often she fixed it. Her skin carried the soft creases of age, not sharp or heavy, but settled, like lines that had earned their place over time. Her hands were different, rough, capable, marked by work that had never been dramatic, but had never stopped. Her husband had always said her hands told the truth about her. Walter Bennett had been a large man, the kind who filled a doorway without trying. Even in his 60s, his shoulders stayed square, his posture straight, as if years in uniform had never quite left him. His beard, kept short and even, had gone gray before the rest of him seemed ready. He didn't speak loudly, but people listened when he did, not because he demanded it, but because he never said anything he didn't mean. He had been a police officer for over 30 years, and near the end, something in him had changed. Martha never heard him say it directly. Walter was not the kind of man who spoke about doubts easily, but she noticed the small things, the way he stayed up later than usual, papers spread across the kitchen table, the way he started carrying a small notebook in his shirt pocket, writing things down in short, careful lines. Dates, names, arrows that connected one thing to another. Once, she had asked him what it was. "Just keeping track," he said, but his eyes didn't leave the page when he answered. There were nights when he sat in silence, fingers tapping lightly against the table, as if the answer was almost there, but refused to settle. Martha learned not to interrupt those moments. She had lived with him long enough to recognize when he was close to something important, and when that something wasn't ready to be spoken yet. Then, one winter morning, before any of it had found shape, Walter collapsed in the driveway. They said it was quick. They said he didn't suffer. Martha nodded when people said those things, but what stayed with her wasn't how he died. It was what he left unfinished. After that, life didn't break. It narrowed. Bills came. Meals became simpler. The garden grew smaller each year. The days stretched out, not empty, but quieter, like a room where sound had been lowered just enough that you noticed its absence. And the town had already begun its slow retreat. Fields once worked by families for generations stood unused, the soil turning over to weeds. Storefronts dimmed one by one, their windows collecting dust no one wiped away. People left in small, unremarkable ways. No announcements, no goodbyes, just fewer cars in driveways, fewer lights at night. Martha stayed. Not because she believed it would get better, but because leaving required something she no longer had. A destination, a plan, a reason strong enough to begin again. The eviction notice came on a Thursday. It was written plainly, without harshness, which somehow made it harder to read. Gerald Pike stood in the doorway while she looked at it. He was a thin man, slightly hunched, with a receding hairline and the kind of anxious expression that made it seem like he was always waiting to be forgiven for something. His hands stayed clasped together, fingers rubbing against each other in small, repetitive movements. "I held off as long as I could," he said quietly. "You know how things are." Martha did know. That was the problem. She folded the paper once, then again, aligning the edges carefully before setting it on the table. "You've got 2 weeks," Gerald added, softer now. "I'm sorry." She nodded, not because she accepted it, but because there was nothing to say that would change it. That night, she sat by the kitchen window, watching the street. A single car passed. Then nothing. The quiet didn't feel new. It felt settled. She thought about numbers, what she had left, what it could cover, how long it would last. Not long. The next morning, she walked past the post office on her way back from the grocery store. The bulletin board outside had been there longer than she could remember. Its wood warped, the glass cracked in one corner. Most of the papers pinned to it had faded into unreadable shapes. But one notice was new. County auction. She almost kept walking. Then she stopped. Her eyes moved across the listings without interest, until one line held her there. Former post office building. She read it again and again. The number below it wasn't small, but it wasn't impossible. Martha stood there longer than she expected, the wind pressing lightly against her coat. Buying a building like that didn't make sense, not at her age, not with what she had left. She knew that. But she also knew what 2 weeks meant. She could leave, or she could stay. The choice didn't feel like courage. It felt like narrowing the path until only one direction remained. She went to the county office that afternoon. Denise Harper sat behind the counter, her posture straight, her movements efficient. She had sharp features and neatly pinned blonde hair, the kind of appearance that suggested she preferred things to be in order. When she saw which property Martha had marked, she paused. "You understand the condition of that building?" Denise asked. "It hasn't been maintained. There may be structural damage." Martha nodded. "No guarantees. No claims after purchase." Another nod. Denise studied her for a moment, as if expecting hesitation. But Martha had already made her decision before she walked in. The paperwork was simple. A signature. A stamp. And just like that, the building belonged to her. Word spread before she made it home. At Miller's Hardware, Tom Weller leaned against the counter, shaking his head. He was a broad man with thick hands and a permanent crease between his brows, the kind of man who had spent his life working with things that could be fixed. "That place should have been torn down years ago," he said. "Guess some folks don't know when to let go," someone replied. Martha heard about it later. She didn't argue. People explained things the way they needed to. She moved in 2 days later. The building smelled of damp wood and thyme. Light filtered through cracked windows, catching dust in thin, floating lines. The floor shifted slightly under her weight in places, not enough to break, but enough to remind her that nothing there had been cared for in a long while. She chose a corner room. It held. That was enough. That night, lying on her sleeping bag, Martha listened to the building. Wind moved through the walls. Something creaked deeper inside. Not loud, not threatening, just present. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she thought of Walter. Not as he was at the end, but as he had been when something mattered. "You'll figure it out," he used to say. Not because he knew how, but because she always had. Martha opened her eyes again. The darkness didn't feel empty. Somewhere in the building, something shifted, soft, almost unnoticeable, not settling, not breaking, just there. And for reasons she couldn't explain, Martha had the quiet sense that whatever Walter had been searching for hadn't been lost, only left behind. Morning light came slowly through the cracked windows, thin and pale, settling unevenly across the floor, as if the building itself had not yet decided whether to wake. Martha Bennett woke before the light reached her fully, not from noise, not from discomfort, but from a quiet awareness that something in the room did not feel the same as it had the night before. It wasn't fear. It was the kind of noticing that comes from years of living in places where small changes mattered. She sat up carefully, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The air still held the cold from the night, lingering in the walls and floor beneath her. For a moment, she did nothing, just listened. The building was still. Routine came next. She reached for the kettle, poured what water she had left, and set it over the small stove. The flame flickered low, steady, but weak. While it heated, she looked around the room again. Not casually this time, but with intention. That was when she saw it. Near the far edge of the room, where the morning light angled across the floor, one board caught the light differently. Not brighter, not darker, just slightly off. Martha didn't move right away. She poured her tea first, sat back down, and let the warmth settle into her hands, while her eyes stayed on the board. It wasn't loose in an obvious way. It hadn't shifted enough to be dangerous, but it didn't belong to the rest of the floor the way the others did. "That's not where you've been sitting," she said quietly. When she stood, she moved slowly, placing each step with care. The boards answered beneath her feet with soft, familiar sounds. When she reached the uneven plank, she lowered herself down instead of bending, one hand bracing against her knee. She touched the edge of the board lightly. It moved. Not freely, not broken. Just enough. She pressed again, testing it the way she might test a loose cabinet hinge or a drawer that didn't quite close right. The board lifted. Beneath it was a metal box. She didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she looked at the space around it, the edges of the wood, the way the board had been placed back. This hadn't been accidental. Someone had opened this before, more than once. Martha let out a slow breath, then slid her hands under the box and lifted it onto her lap. It was heavier than she expected, the metal cool and slightly rough with age. The latch showed rust, but not enough to have sealed it shut. She ran her thumb along the edge, feeling where metal met metal. "You've been waiting a while," she murmured. Still, she didn't open it right away. She turned it slightly, checking for markings, for anything that might explain its purpose. There were none, just plain metal, functional, quiet. Finally, she lifted the latch. Inside was a key, old, solid, worn in the way only something often used becomes. Beneath it lay a folded piece of paper. Martha picked up the paper first, unfolding it slowly and smoothing it against her knee. The lines were hand-drawn, not precise, but deliberate. It took her a moment to recognize it, not because it was unclear, but because she hadn't expected it. It was a layout of the building, or part of it. Her eyes moved carefully across the lines. The counter, the sorting area, the shelving behind it. And then, faint, almost hesitant, a square space drawn where no space should be. Martha didn't rush to stand. She sat there, comparing the paper to the room, adjusting her angle, aligning what she saw with what was drawn. It wasn't exact, but it didn't need to be. It was close enough to mean something. She reached back into the box and took the key. It fit naturally in her hand. "All right," she said softly. She closed the box, set it aside, and pushed herself up. The room felt different now. Not changed, just understood in a new way. She stepped into the hallway. The air grew cooler as she moved away from the room, carrying the faint scent of old paper and wood. The sorting area came into view slowly, the long counter still standing, worn along its edges, the tall shelving unit behind it leaning slightly. Tired, but steady. Martha stopped a few steps away. She didn't go straight to it. Instead, she looked at the wall behind the shelves, then back at the paper, then at the shelves again. "If I were hiding something," she said quietly, "I wouldn't make it easy." She stepped around the counter and placed both hands against the side of the shelving unit. She waited a moment, steadying herself, then pushed. At first it barely moved, just enough to scrape against the floor. She adjusted her footing and pushed again, slow and even. This time, it shifted. Not far, but enough. Behind it, the wall was not solid. There was a seam, barely visible beneath layers of old paint. But there. Martha stepped closer, her hand reaching out, fingers brushing along the surface until they found it. The faint outline of a door. Small, narrow, meant to disappear. She stood there for a long moment, her hand resting lightly against it. Then she looked down at the key in her hand. She didn't insert it. Not yet. Instead, she lifted it, held it just in front of the lock, and stopped. The hidden room was smaller than Martha had expected, but it did not feel cramped. It felt deliberate. The air inside was dry in a way the rest of the building was not, as if someone had worked hard once to keep damp and time from reaching this place. Shelves had been built directly into the walls, sturdy and plain, lined with boxes that looked less stored than arranged. Some were marked in small, careful handwriting. Others had been left blank, which somehow made them feel heavier. Martha did not begin with the most obvious box or the neatest one. She chose one from the middle shelf, the kind of box a person might reach for only if they already knew what was inside. She set it down on the floor, eased herself beside it, and lifted the lid. The documents inside were ordinary at first glance. Farm loan applications, mortgage agreements, requests for relief after storms, bad harvests, medical emergencies. The kind of papers people filled out when they had already spent weeks trying not to ask for help, and then finally did because there was nowhere else to turn. Martha recognized the forms even before she read the names. She had seen enough of that sort of paper across a lifetime to know the feel of it. The stiffness, the cheap grain, the way important things were so often printed on something that tore too easily. She turned a few pages without thinking much, letting her eyes pass over numbers and signatures until a name made her stop. Earl Donnelly. Martha held the page still. Earl had lived down the road for years, in a white farmhouse that leaned a little more every winter. He had been tall once, though by the end he carried himself with a permanent bend in his shoulders, as if weather and worry had taken turns pressing down on him. He had always removed his hat when he spoke to someone, even children, and his voice had the soft drag of a man who had spent too many years speaking only when there was something worth saying. When he lost his land, he told people the figures simply hadn't worked out. Nobody questioned it. Men like Earl rarely complained in public. They just absorbed what happened and called it life. Martha looked at the first page again. The application had been approved. She frowned and turned the next sheet, then another. That was when she saw it. Not a dramatic difference, not something that would leap out to a stranger. It was smaller than that. The signature on the follow-up page carried a different pressure. The letters had the same shape, but not the same motion. The line of the pen hesitated where it should have flowed. Walter had once told her that most people looked at signatures the wrong way. "They think it's about matching the letters," he had said one evening at the kitchen table, running a fingertip over a receipt, as if the paper might answer back. "But it's not the letters. It's the hand behind them." Martha laid the Donnelly file aside and opened another. Clara Jensen. Clara had been one of those women who always seemed more tired than old, though she had become both in the end. She was fair-skinned and narrow-faced, with pale hair she wore pinned up so tightly it seemed to pull the expression from her face. Her husband had been sick for years before he died, and illness had turned their home into a place of bills, medicine bottles, and quiet apologies. When Clara lost the house, she told everyone the insurance company had left her with too little. People nodded because it sounded like the kind of thing that happened all the time. The first page of her file showed approval. The next pages told a different story. Numbers that had once aligned no longer did. Amounts had been revised. Notes had been added in a hand Martha didn't trust, not because she knew whose it was yet, but because it felt too clean, too certain. There was no hesitation in it. No trace of a person making a decision they regretted. Just a smooth correction that changed the meaning of everything that came before it. This time, Martha said nothing at all. She simply placed Clara's file beside Earl's and reached for a third. The Markley brothers. Even reading the name made her almost hear them. Two men who had owned the hardware store before Tom Weller took it over. Broad in the chest, ruddy-faced, always half a laugh and half an argument away from one another. They used to talk over each other so often that people stopped trying to tell which one had started a story. Their shop had closed suddenly, and the explanation had been simple enough. The loan never came through. That was what everybody said for years afterward, as if repeating it often enough made it true. Martha did not linger over the first page. She turned to the center of the file where the decision should have been. Approved. Then altered. Again. She sat back slightly, her knees complaining now, and placed the three files side by side across the floorboards. Earl. Clara. The Markleys. Different years, different needs, different lives, but the same sequence. Application. Approval. Change. Loss. For a long moment she looked at them without touching anything, not wanting to rush past what was becoming visible. The room stayed quiet around her. No creak from the walls. No shifting from the building outside. Just the dry stillness of a place that had kept its own counsel for too long. Then she reached for a second box. This one was heavier, packed tighter. Inside were transfer sheets and ledger pages, not tied to individual families so neatly. These were colder documents, columns of numbers, routing notations, account references. Martha did not pretend to understand every mark on the page, but she understood direction. Money had not vanished into thin air. It had moved. More importantly, it had moved away from where it had first belonged. She followed one line with her finger, then another. The names she had just read in the personal files appeared again here, but not as people receiving help. They appeared as points of origin, their approved funds, their accounts, their claims. Each one touching a trail that led elsewhere. Martha's breathing slowed. Not because she was calm, but because focus had taken the place of everything else. That was when she saw the first name that did not belong to a family in trouble. Thomas Whitaker. She knew that name as surely as she knew the sound of the church bell in winter. Thomas had been one of those men who seemed built for small-town authority. Broad-shouldered even in old age, a heavy mustache that somehow made every sentence feel official, and the habit of standing with his thumbs hooked near his belt when he spoke to people. He served on committees, chaired meetings, broke ground at public projects, and stood in the front row of every photograph that involved ribbon cutting or money. If a decision mattered, his name was usually somewhere near it. Martha turned another page. The name appeared again. Then another. After Thomas came Evan Whitaker. The son had inherited none of the father's heaviness, only his position. Evan was in his mid-40s now, clean-shaven, sharp-eyed, and always dressed as if he expected to be seen from a distance. Where Thomas had taken up space by force of habit, Evan took it by design. His voice stayed controlled. His suits were never flashy, just fitted enough to suggest he knew exactly what impression he was making. People in town called him efficient, which was often the word they used when a man made them uncomfortable, but remained useful. Martha had never trusted men who looked too polished in places like this. Now she understood why. Thomas in the earlier years, Evan in the later ones. Not a break in the pattern, but a continuation of it. A handoff. A structure that had learned how to survive the death of one man by settling neatly into the life of another. Martha kept reading, but she was no longer searching for surprise. She was tracing shape. Dates aligned with public hard years the town still remembered. The flood year, the winter 2 feed stores closed, the spring Clara lost her house. Each time, the same rhythm returned. Help approved, paper altered, money diverted, loss explained away. By the time she stopped, the floor around her had become a scatter of stories that were not separate at all. For years, people in town had believed what people in towns like that always believed when things went bad slowly enough, that they had done something wrong. Borrowed too much, waited too long. Misread the season, trusted the wrong person. Bought at the wrong time. Signed what they should have questioned. They carried their own failures because carrying them felt simpler than imagining someone had built a system to profit from their trust. Martha gathered the papers one by one, not hurriedly, but with the care a person uses when touching something that no longer belongs only to the past. These were not just records. They were explanations. Not the kind people wanted, but the kind that stayed once they had been seen. Walter had not been chasing a vague unease. He had been close to this. Maybe closer than she had understood while he was alive. The thought did not strike her like grief. It landed more quietly than that, with the weight of something finally finding its place. When she finished, she returned the files to their boxes in the same order she had found them. Then she stood, holding the last ledger page a second longer before placing it down. The dry room seemed smaller now, not because it had changed, but because silence no longer fit inside it as comfortably. She stepped out, closed the hidden door, and guided the shelf back into place until the seam vanished again behind wood and dust. Then she carried the metal box to her room and set it beside her sleeping bag. Not under the floor, not hidden, just beside her, where she could see it in the morning. Martha lowered herself down and rested her hands in her lap. The town had spent years blaming itself for wounds it never made. And now, in the thin stillness of the old post office, she understood that what people had called bad luck had often been something else entirely. She did not say it out loud. She no longer needed to. The knock came just after dark, measured and certain, the kind that did not belong to someone passing by or losing their way. Martha was sitting on the edge of her sleeping bag when it came, the metal box still beside her. The quiet of the old post office settled deep into the walls. She did not jump. She only lifted her head and listened as the sound came again, exactly the same as before. Whoever stood outside was not uncertain, and that told her enough. She rose, pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, and walked toward the front of the building. Through the wavering glass in the door, she saw Evan Whitaker standing beneath the street lamp. He looked exactly like the kind of man a town lets too close to its decisions without realizing the cost. He was in his mid-40s, clean-shaven, narrow at the waist, controlled in every visible line. His coat was dark and well-cut, his shoes polished even on a street that no longer rewarded effort, and his face held that practiced calm some men mistake for honesty. He did not smile when she came near the door, but neither did he need to. Men like Evan rarely wasted expression before they knew which one would serve them best. "Mrs. Bennett," he said when she was close enough to hear him through the glass. "I hope I'm not calling too late." Martha kept one hand on the latch and studied him first. Not just his face, but the stillness of him. He wasn't there to check on her. He was there because something had changed, and he wanted to know how much. She opened the door. Evan stepped in only a pace or two, just enough to be inside without appearing familiar. His gaze moved across the room once, careful and brief. Not curiosity. Recognition. He had either been in the building years ago or spent enough time imagining it to know where a person would put a stove, where a bedroll might lie, where someone might hide something if they believed no one was looking. "It's rougher in here than I remember," he said. Martha closed the door behind him. "Then you remember it better than most." That earned the smallest pause. Not long enough to call surprise, but long enough to matter. Evan glanced toward the dark hallway and then back at her. "Buildings like this keep trouble in quiet ways," he said. "Water damage, weak flooring. Things that don't show themselves until someone has already stayed too long." "Funny," Martha said. "No one seemed too worried about it until now." His expression remained composed. "Some places only become important when someone decides to make use of them." Martha said nothing, and he went on. "You're not the first person who thought they might do something with this building," he said. "There have been others over the years. A man who wanted to store equipment in here. Another who talked about reopening part of it as a shipping office. Someone else stayed a week or so, then left. In the end, no one thought it was worth the trouble." That was the first honest thing he had said, or close to it. Martha heard what sat underneath the words. No one stayed. or no one was allowed to stay comfortably enough to keep looking. "And you kept track of that?" she asked. "I try to keep track of anything that affects the town." There were men who said "the town" as though they meant the people in it. Evan said it like he meant the machinery beneath it. He took another step, slow and measured. "My father used to say places like this hold on to old problems. Paper trails, confusions, stories that get bigger just because they've been left alone too long. Most of the time, disturbing them doesn't help anyone." Martha watched him without blinking. "That depends who got helped the first time." Something flickered in his eyes then, quickly covered. He adjusted one cuff with the hand out in his pocket, a neat, thoughtless movement that was not thoughtless at all. "You've always been a careful woman," he said. "Walter was too." There it was. Not just her. Walter. Martha felt something inside her settle, instead of rise. "You knew he was looking into something." Evan did not deny it. "Your husband asked questions in places where answers were rarely simple. Men like him sometimes mistook persistence for protection." Martha almost smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "And men like you mistake control for order." The silence that followed was thinner now, but sharper. Outside, a truck passed somewhere in the distance, its sound fading before it reached them. Evan shifted his weight slightly, as if deciding whether to keep the conversation polished or let it become plain. "I'm only saying," he replied, "that if you come across anything unusual, it would be better handled properly. There are legal issues with old records, old properties, old claims. Things can become messy very quickly, especially for someone on her own." Not a threat. Not directly. Just a man laying consequences on the table and pretending they had appeared there by themselves. Martha folded her hands loosely. "You've been waiting for someone to find something in here." He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I've been aware for years that this building was shut down with questions still attached to it. Questions my father never resolved. Questions other people were too careless or too frightened to look at properly. But you never found what you were looking for." "No," he said, and this time the answer came a little faster than he meant it to. "Not everything leaves itself where you expect." Martha let that sit between them. So he knew enough to be uneasy, but not enough to be calm. That mattered. "You made sure no one stayed long enough," she said. Evan's face did not change, but his voice did. It grew quieter. "People leave when a place gives them reason to. A roof leak, an inspection, a warning from the county. A few practical inconveniences usually do more than force ever could." He had said it too smoothly, as if he had watched it work often enough to trust the method. Martha nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding. "So that's how you've been keeping watch." Evan did not answer. He moved toward the door instead, then stopped with his hand on the handle. "If something has surfaced," he said, "it would be better if I knew before anyone else does. Some things don't belong in the hands of people who only understand half of them." "Why would you know the other half?" Martha asked. For the first time that night, he hesitated without hiding it quickly enough. "Because I know what this town can survive," he said. Then he opened the door and stepped back out into the dark. Martha stood where she was long after the door had shut. The room seemed smaller now, not because Evan had taken up much space, but because he had confirmed more than he intended to. He had known there was something in the building. He had been waiting for it to appear. And he had spent years making sure no one settled in long enough to stumble across it by accident. She turned toward her room, but she did not sit down immediately. Instead, she stood beside the little stove and let her hands rest on the back of the chair she had dragged in from the sorting area that afternoon. Walter had stood like that once, years ago, staring at the kitchen table after a long day, his jaw set, his notebook still open where he had left it. That memory came back now with an exactness she hadn't expected. He had come home later than usual, removed his coat, and stayed silent until she set supper in front of him. Then he had said, very quietly, "They're going to close it off." She had looked up from the stove. "Who?" He shook his head. "That part doesn't matter anymore." "What matters then?" Walter had looked down at the notebook, then toward the window, as if measuring how much of the truth could safely be spoken inside his own home. "Someone has to stay where they are," he said. "If both of us get pushed out, it's over." At the time, she had not understood who the other man was. Later, she did. Raymond Carter had been Walter's partner for years, back when they were both still young enough to believe duty was something solid. Raymond was shorter than Walter and broader through the middle, with a neck thickened by age and shoulders that had once been athletic before time turned strength into endurance. He had a face cut in hard lines, not handsome exactly, but dependable, and a nose that had likely been broken once and never reset quite right. His hair had gone sparse early, but his eyes remained sharp, pale, and patient. He was the kind of man who listened without interrupting and remembered more than people meant to reveal. It was that habit, more than anything, that had made him good at police work and dangerous to the wrong people. Walter had taken the blow that should have landed on Raymond. Not theatrically, not nobly in the way stories liked to frame such things. He had simply stepped into the space where the blame would fall, absorbing procedure, reprimand, and the quiet sidelining that followed. Officially, it had been about conduct, about stepping beyond scope, about making a departmental matter too personal. Unofficially, it had been about stopping one man and sparing another just enough room to keep watching. Martha had known it, even when Walter refused to explain it plainly. She had seen the cost in the way he stopped wearing the notebook in his breast pocket after that, though he never threw it away. She had seen it in the way Raymond started calling less often, not because their friendship had weakened, but because whatever remained between them had become dangerous to say out loud. Now, in the thin cold of the post office, that old shape finally made sense. Walter had not failed to finish what he started. He had carried it as far as he could and left it where it might still be found. Martha sat down at last and reached for the phone on the crate beside her sleeping bag. The number came back to her slowly, not forgotten so much as buried under years in which she had no use for it. When the call connected, the voice on the other end was rougher than she remembered, but still grounded in the same steadiness. "Carter, it's Martha Bennett," she said. "Walter's wife." There was a pause, then a quieter reply. "I know who you are." She looked toward the hallway, toward the wall behind which the hidden room waited. "I think I found where he stopped." The silence on the other end did not feel like doubt. It felt like a door opening somewhere else. "Where are you?" Raymond asked. "At the post office." Another pause. Then, "I'll come in the morning." Martha held the receiver a second longer before setting it down. The room was quiet again, but not in the same way. The quiet now had direction inside it. This wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the first time she could see the shape of what had never truly ended. Raymond Carter arrived just after sunrise in a pickup truck that sounded older than the road beneath it. The engine gave one last tired shudder before falling silent, and for a moment the whole street seemed to listen with him. Martha was already awake. She had been for some time, sitting near the front window with a cup of weak coffee gone half cold in her hands, watching the pale morning gather over Maple Street. When Raymond stepped out of the truck, he paused before closing the door, not from stiffness, but from habit, as though he preferred to take in a place before entering it. He looked older than she remembered, but not diminished. He was shorter than Walter had been, and broader now through the middle, the kind of man whose weight came not from softness, but from years that had settled onto him without apology. His hair had thinned to a gray fringe above the ears, and the lines in his face had deepened into something close to weathering. His nose had never quite healed straight after being broken long ago, and his jaw still carried the old firmness of a man who had spent much of his life refusing to be hurried into the wrong conclusion. What age had taken from him in speed, it had returned in steadiness. His eyes were the same as ever, pale, alert, and patient enough to let other people talk themselves into revealing more than they meant to. Martha opened the door before he knocked. Raymond stepped inside and removed his cap, not out of politeness so much as instinct. His gaze moved once through the room, taking in the stove, the sleeping bag, the crate beside it, the way she had arranged the few things she needed. He didn't ask whether she was managing. Men like him knew the insult inside that question. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I slept enough," Martha answered. That seemed to satisfy him. He gave a single nod. "Show me." She led him through the back, past the sorting counter, to the shelving unit she had pushed aside the day before. Raymond stood in front of the hidden seam for longer than she expected, not touching it at first. He had the look of a man standing before something he had once imagined 100 different ways and was now forced to see plainly. When she handed him the key, he weighed it in his palm for a moment before fitting it into the lock. The door opened with less resistance than it had for Martha. Inside, Raymond moved carefully, but not delicately. He began the way a good investigator always does, not with the biggest clue, but with the room itself. He studied the shelving, the order of the boxes, the labels that appeared, and the ones that had been omitted. He ran a thumb along the edge of one ledger and frowned at the lack of moisture damage. Then he opened the first box she had already searched and began reading. Martha did not speak. She watched his face instead. He went through the personal files first, slower than she had. Earl Donnelly, Clara Jensen, the Markley brothers. With each file, the lines around Raymond's mouth deepened. He compared dates, looked twice at the altered signatures, then set those pages aside in a separate pile without comment. When he reached the transfer records, he stopped using the box lids as support and moved the papers directly onto the floorboards, arranging them by year and by account reference. Only after all that did he find the newer packet. The paper alone marked it as out of place, cleaner, stiffer, less touched by time. Raymond unfolded it and read the first page without expression. He read the second more slowly. By the time he reached the signature page, something in his posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough for Martha to know he had found the piece he had been missing for years. "What is it?" she asked. Raymond held the packet a little higher, as though putting distance between himself and the words might somehow make them less final. "A development contract," he said. "Eastern County Line. Newer than everything else in here." Martha moved closer. She saw the signature at the bottom before she understood the legal language above it. Evan Whitaker. Raymond turned back to the first page and followed several attached references with his finger. The account listed here ties back to one of the older diverted funds. Same routing family. Same shell structure, just buried under a cleaner name. He looked up at her then. This is it, Martha. This is the part Walter never got. Martha read what she could and let the rest settle by weight, rather than by detail. She did not need to understand every clause to recognize what mattered. The money had not only been stolen long ago, it had been preserved, grown, used again. What Thomas Whitaker helped build, Evan had not merely inherited. He was still feeding it. They worked for the next hour in near silence. Raymond sorted records into categories with a discipline that made the room feel smaller and clearer at the same time. Altered personal files, transfer chains, and current documents connecting the old theft to present deals. Martha wrote down names, dates, and account numbers in a spare notebook, her hand slow but steady. The more they placed beside one another, the less accidental anything looked. There was no chaos in the pattern. That was what made it chilling. This had not been greed acting in bursts. It had been order. By the time Raymond stood, the floor between them held not a pile of old papers, but a structure. He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck and looked toward the hidden doorway. Walter was already close, he said. Closer than I knew. Martha rested her palm lightly on the notebook. You thought he was chasing shadows? Raymond gave a short breath that might once have become a laugh. No, I thought he was chasing too much at once. There's a difference. He carried the newer contract and several transfer pages out into the front room, where the light was better. Martha put water on for coffee, while he read everything again from the beginning. Slower this time, as if the second reading might expose an error merciful enough to release them from what the first had already made clear. It did not. When she handed him a mug, he did not drink immediately. He stood near the front window, but not in it, looking out across the street without letting himself be seen too clearly from outside. That was fast, he said. Martha sat down. What was? Evan coming here last night. Raymond turned slightly, not enough to face her fully. He moved before you told anyone. That means something about this building being occupied again reached him quickly enough to matter. Martha thought of the hardware store, the county office, the eyes a small town always had, even when no one seemed to be watching. Could have been anyone. It could have, Raymond said, but not just anyone would make him come himself. He finally took a sip of coffee, then set the mug down on the windowsill and stayed standing. There's a young patrol officer with the county now, Daniel Reeves. Been around 3, maybe 4 years. Too polished for the job and too ambitious to hide it. Martha waited. Raymond continued. Clean haircut, straight posture. Talks like he's already practicing for a desk he hasn't earned yet. He nearly washed out early on over a domestic call. Pushed too hard, escalated too fast. Then wrote the report like he was the only adult in the room. Should have cost him more than it did. But Evan put his name in the right ear at the right time, and the problem went away. So, now he listens in return. Raymond gave a single nod. Men like Daniel don't think of it as corruption. They think of it as alignment. They tell themselves they're close to the people who keep things functioning. As though called by the thought, a patrol car moved slowly past the front of the post office. It did not stop. It did not need to. Raymond shifted a half-step farther from the window. Martha remained where she was and let herself look. Daniel Reeves had the kind of face that still carried the remains of boyhood under the effort of authority. He was in his early 30s, dark-haired, clean-skinned, and too carefully composed behind the wheel. His jaw was smooth, his uniform neat, his shoulders set as if he had spent years teaching himself how a dependable man should sit. But there was strain in the neatness. The strain of someone who had once come close to losing what he wanted and had decided never to come that close again. He turned his head just enough to see the building. Then he kept driving. Raymond waited until the patrol car disappeared before speaking again. He knows I'm here now. If he didn't already matter, he does after that. Martha looked toward the street. Then Evan will know by lunch. That's my thought, too. The rest of the afternoon became quieter and more deliberate. Raymond did not take everything, only what mattered most: the newer contract, several connecting transfer sheets, and just enough corroboration to make denial difficult. The older ledgers stayed in the hidden room for now. Martha helped by returning less critical papers to visible stacks and leaving a few harmless documents in plain sight, the kind someone might notice through a window and mistake for the whole story. By evening, the post office looked almost unchanged. That was the point. At the door, Raymond adjusted the canvas tool bag on his shoulder. To anyone passing, it would look like he had come by to help an old friend sort through a building and was leaving with nothing more dangerous than wrenches or receipts. "We don't go to county offices," he said. "Not yet. Not sheriff's department either. Too many hands between here and anything official." "Then what do we do?" Raymond looked back once, not at her, but at the walls. "We watch what starts moving before we say a word. If the wrong people react to what they shouldn't know yet, that tells us exactly where the leak is." He stepped outside, then paused near the truck. "Walter was right about one thing," he said. "Truth doesn't disappear. But it can be delayed a long time by people who know where to stand." Martha watched him drive away, the canvas bag on the seat beside him. For the first time, the truth was no longer only something hidden in a wall behind a shelf. It had entered the road. Martha did not arrive at the plan all at once. It came to her the way most practical things had over the years, not as an idea, but as a feeling that something needed to be moved out of sight, not hidden carefully, but placed somewhere so ordinary that no one would think to question it. She stood at the table for a long moment, looking at the documents, her fingers resting lightly against the edge, as if she could feel the weight of them beyond paper. Walter had always believed in doing things directly, but she had learned something different in the years after he was gone, that sometimes survival depended on being overlooked. Raymond watched her without interrupting. He had seen that look before, not in her, but in others who had reached the point where hesitation no longer served a purpose. "You have something," he said quietly. Martha nodded once. "We don't stop him." Raymond's brow shifted slightly. "Daniel?" "Yes," she said. "If he's already coming, we don't change that. We let him take what he thinks he came for." Raymond stepped closer to the table, his gaze lowering to the documents. "You're talking about giving him something." "I'm talking about letting him choose it," Martha replied. "That's different." That distinction settled between them. Raymond exhaled slowly, then nodded. "He'll take it straight to Evan." Martha looked at the contract with Evan's signature. "He'll believe it's enough. And if he checks? He won't check what he wants to be true." They moved without rushing after that. The decision had already been made, and everything that followed was simply carrying it out. Raymond began assembling the copy, not a complete fabrication, but a careful rearrangement of truth. He removed key connections, softened the links between transactions, and adjusted the sequence just enough to create a version that appeared whole while quietly breaking under pressure. Martha gathered the original documents herself. She moved toward the back of the post office, past the main room, into the area where the old sorting shelves still stood. Wooden compartments lined the wall, each one worn smooth by decades of use, most of them now holding nothing but dust and forgotten envelopes. She paused there, her eyes scanning not for the best hiding place, but for the most forgettable one. Her hand moved toward the upper row, sliding aside a stack of yellowed mail that had likely sat untouched for years. Behind it, a narrow space opened just enough. She placed the documents inside, then returned the envelopes to their place, adjusting them slightly until everything looked exactly as it had before. She stepped back and studied it. It didn't look hidden. It looked ignored. That was safer. When she returned to the front room, Raymond had finished. The false set of documents rested on the table, arranged with the same care as the originals had been, indistinguishable at a glance. "Will it hold?" she asked. Raymond met her eyes. "Long enough for him to believe it does." They dimmed the light, leaving the room in a soft, uneven glow that made shapes visible, but uncertain. Martha sat in a chair near the wall, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her breathing steady. Raymond remained near the door, not guarding it, but positioned in a way that allowed him to listen. They didn't speak. Time moved slowly, stretching in the quiet. Then, sometime after midnight, there was a shift. Not a sound loud enough to name, but a change in the room that both of them felt at the same moment. A presence where there hadn't been one before. Daniel Reeves entered carefully, his movements controlled but not practiced enough to disappear completely. He paused just inside the doorway, listening. Then he moved toward the table. His eyes passed over the room once, quick but thorough, satisfied. He reached for the documents. For a brief moment, his hand hovered above them. It wasn't doubt. It was recognition. Something inside him acknowledging that this was a line. Then he crossed it. He gathered the papers, holding them more firmly than necessary, and turned toward the door. His pace quickened slightly as he left, not running, but no longer careful. The door closed behind him. The room returned to stillness. Martha remained seated for a moment longer before rising and walking to the table. She looked down at the empty space where the documents had been. "It's done," Raymond said. Martha nodded, but there was no relief in her expression. Across town, Daniel sat in his car with the documents beside him, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. He stared ahead, his jaw set, replaying the moment in his mind. Not what he had done, but how easily it had happened. Too easily. He pushed that thought aside. At the same time, Evan Whitaker stood in his office, the lights still on, the blinds half drawn. He had not been told anything yet, but he was waiting. When Daniel entered, Evan turned immediately. "You have it?" he asked. Daniel placed the documents on the desk. Evan studied him briefly, then opened the file. Minutes passed. Then he closed the folder. "That's everything?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Good," Evan said. The next morning, the pressure was gone. No car lingered near the post office. No unfamiliar presence appeared. Martha stood at the window again. But this time, nothing looked back. Behind her, Raymond said quietly, "He believes it." Martha nodded. "Yes." Raymond leaned back. "That gives us time." Martha kept her eyes on the window. This wasn't victory, it was space. And sometimes, that was the only way forward. Martha did not wait for the morning to begin working. By the time the first light touched the edge of the town, she was already at the table, her hands moving slowly across the documents as if she were not arranging paper, but finishing something that had been left incomplete for far too long. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because nothing in it needed to be hidden anymore. Raymond Hale arrived not long after, carrying the same quiet presence he always had, but with something heavier behind it. He closed the door carefully, not out of caution, but out of habit, formed from years of knowing when something mattered enough to be contained. "You didn't sleep," he said. Martha shook her head slightly. There wasn't anything left to wait for. The table in front of them no longer held fragments. It held structure. Every document had been placed with intention, each one connected to the next in a way that made it impossible to separate cause from consequence. The contract bearing Evan Whitaker's signature no longer stood alone. It sat within a pattern that stretched backward through years of quiet damage and forward into something that could no longer be denied. Raymond leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the arrangement, not searching for mistakes, but testing its strength. "This holds," he said after a moment. Martha nodded. "It has to." She moved her hand slowly across the edge of the papers, stopping briefly near a name she recognized. A family that had left in winter. A man who had stopped speaking to anyone before he disappeared from the routines of the town. For years, she had accepted those things as part of life. Now she understood. "They lived with it," she said quietly. Raymond followed her gaze. "Because they thought it was theirs to carry." Martha shook her head slightly. "It wasn't." Raymond straightened, his expression settling into something more defined. "Then we don't let it stay here." He reached for the satchel, placing it on the table with care. The leather creaked slightly as it opened, a small sound that carried more weight than it should have. "I'm not running this through the county," he said. "Not through anyone who's been part of this place long enough to recognize what it is." Martha met his eyes. "Then you go past them." "I go around them," Raymond replied. He began placing the documents inside, maintaining their order, his movements steady but deliberate. Each page entered the satchel as if it were crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. Once it left his hands, it would no longer belong to the town. Martha watched him, her expression calm, but her thoughts moving elsewhere. Walter had stood in rooms like this before, holding pieces of something he couldn't quite finish. She remembered the way he used to sit at the table late at night, reading, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too much without having enough to prove it. "He got close," she said. Raymond didn't look up. "He got far enough to be stopped." Martha's hand rested lightly against the table. "Then we don't stop." Raymond closed the satchel. That was the moment. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. When he left, the door closed with a quiet finality that felt different from before. Not an ending. A transfer. Martha remained where she was, standing in the same place, looking at the same table. Only now, it was empty. Not missing something. Freed from holding it. Across town, Daniel Reeves sat at his desk again, the documents spread in front of him. The same ones he had taken, the same ones he had believed. But belief had begun to shift. He leaned forward, tracing the lines again, slower this time, not following the structure, but testing it. The numbers aligned, the approvals followed. The movement made sense, until he tried to follow it beyond what was given. That was where it broke. Daniel sat back, his jaw tightening slightly. He was not used to this feeling, not uncertainty, but the sense that something had been arranged in a way that expected him not to look too closely. That was new. Across from him, Lila Grant watched quietly. "You're seeing it now," she said. Daniel looked up. "Seeing what?" Lila tilted her head slightly. "The part that doesn't want to be seen." Across town, Evan Whitaker sat alone in his office, the documents laid out before him once more. He had already reviewed them. Each time they confirmed what he needed. And yet, something resisted. He adjusted the pages slightly, then another, aligning them as if order might produce certainty. It didn't. Evan leaned back slowly, his fingers pressed together, his expression unchanged. But his certainty no longer moved ahead of him. It followed. Cautiously. By late afternoon, Raymond reached the state office. Arthur Klein processed the documents. Forms were filled, entries recorded, a number assigned. Once the satchel was closed again, it no longer belonged to Raymond. And it no longer belonged to the town. Back at the post office, evening settled slowly. Martha sat on the porch, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the air cooling around her. Raymond returned just as the light began to fade. "It's done," he said. Martha nodded. "They logged it," he added. "State level." She exhaled quietly. "And here?" she asked. Raymond looked out across the town. "It stays quiet," he said. "For now." Martha leaned back slightly. She understood. This wasn't the moment the truth appeared. It was the moment it could no longer be contained. And this time, no one would be able to stop it. The change did not arrive as an event. It had already begun before anyone could point to the moment it started. By the time the first officials came into town, opening files and asking questions in voices that did not belong to the place, the truth had already moved past the point of being contained. Martha Bennett noticed it not in what people said, but in how they stood. Shoulders that had once carried something unseen now settled just slightly lower. Conversations that used to end quickly stretched a little longer. Nothing dramatic. Nothing declared, but the weight had shifted. She remained on the porch of the post office, as she had in the days before, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture steady. The building behind her no longer felt like it was holding something hidden. It felt open in a way that was unfamiliar, as if it had finally been allowed to become what it had always been meant to be. Raymond Hale arrived later that afternoon, his movements slower, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet recognition that the part of the work that required him to act had already been done. What remained no longer belonged to him. "They've started pulling everything," he said, taking a seat beside her. "Not just what we found. Everything connected to it." Martha nodded once. "They'll see it." "Yes," Raymond said. "And this time, it won't stop halfway." Across town, Evan Whitaker sat in his office. The same desk, the same view, but nothing in it held the same certainty anymore. The documents he had once trusted now sat closed, not because he no longer needed them, but because they no longer gave him what he had been looking for. He had been asked to cooperate, not accused, not yet judged, but the request had not been optional. Evan had spent most of his life believing that control came from understanding how systems worked, how they could be guided, adjusted, redirected without being noticed. That belief had carried him further than most people ever reached. Now, it no longer carried him at all. He sat back in his chair, his hands resting against the armrests, his gaze unfocused for a moment longer than he would have allowed himself before. When the investigators returned, he did not resist. He answered what was asked. Not quickly, not easily, but without trying to change where it would lead. "I didn't start it," he said at one point, his voice steady, though quieter than it had once been. "No," the man across from him replied. "But you chose to continue it." Evan held that for a moment, then gave a small nod. There was nothing else to say. At the station, Daniel Reeves sat across from Lila Grant again, his posture no longer as rigid as it had been, but not yet settled into anything resembling ease. He had spoken fully now, not in fragments, not in hesitation. The words had not come easily. But once they had begun, they had not stopped. "I thought I understood what I was doing," he said quietly. Lila leaned back slightly, her expression unchanged, but her attention steady. "You understood part of it." Daniel let out a slow breath. That was enough to get it wrong. "What happens now?" Daniel asked. Lila considered that. "Now it moves without you needing to hold it up." In the days that followed, the town did not gather in anger. Instead, it gathered in memory. At first, it was small. One or two people stopping by the post office, not for any official reason, but because it had become the place where something had been returned. Something they had not realized they had lost. Clara Vance came again, this time not hesitating at the doorway. She carried with her a small tin box, its surface worn smooth from years of being opened and closed. Inside were letters, some sent, some never finished, some addressed to people who no longer lived in the town. "I kept them," she said, placing the box on the table. "I didn't know why." Martha stood beside her, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table. "You knew," she said softly. "You just didn't have a place for them." Clara nodded, her eyes moving across the room. "I do now." Others followed. Not all at once, not in any organized way, but steadily. Stories were told, not loudly, not all the way through, but enough. Enough for someone else to understand. Enough for something that had once been carried alone to be held, even briefly, by more than one person. The post office changed without anyone deciding it should. Evan met with those who needed to meet with him, not in public, not in a way that turned it into spectacle. He agreed to what could be returned. He accepted what could not. There were no arguments, only a series of conversations that ended with something settled, not repaired, not erased, but acknowledged. One evening, as the light softened across the street, Raymond returned carrying something wrapped in paper. He handed it to Martha. She unwrapped it slowly. Walter's notebook. She opened it carefully. Near the back, a sentence remained unfinished. She read it once, then closed the book. "You could finish it," Raymond said. Martha rested her hand gently against the cover. "It doesn't need finishing," she replied. Martha leaned back slightly in her chair, the notebook resting in her lap. She listened to the quiet voices inside the building. The town would not become what it had been, but it had become something that no longer required silence. And in that quiet, something new had begun. The story did not end with a moment of triumph, but with something quieter, the slow return of trust. What Martha uncovered was not only the truth hidden in documents, but a deeper truth the town had forgotten, that their losses were not their fault. And in restoring that understanding, she gave them something more lasting than justice. She gave them back a sense of belonging. Nothing was fully restored. Some things could never be returned, but they were no longer carried in silence. The old post office became a place where stories could be shared without shame, where people listened, and where healing began in small, human ways. The town did not return to what it once was, but it became something more honest, more connected, and quietly whole. Perhaps that is what grace looks like. Not always in grand miracles, but in the gentle way truth finds its way to light, and people find their way back to each other. If this story stayed with you, you might share where you're listening from or leave a thought below. And if you feel it, you're welcome to follow along for more stories like this. Wherever you are, may peace find you, and may God's blessings rest gently upon your life.